Hey folks, so this session we're going to start to turn some attention onto using homeopathic medicines in acute emotional trauma states, and I think it's kind of an interesting area. My perspective, one person's opinion, is I think people often don't think of homeopathics for acute emotional situations. They're really much more known for kind of complex psychological, constitutional sort of portraits. But I think people, especially users, users wouldn't often think to self-prescribe a homeopathic if they've had some kind of emotional trauma. They're more likely to think of something like a flower essence. And to my mind, probably the reason for that is the indications for homeopathics are much more specific in terms of the specific diagnostic symptoms that we're going to use. It's less easy to look at a homeopathic and go, oh, this is one if you've had a bit of sadness, and this is one if you've had a bit of a shock. But actually, there's pretty much medicines we can use for those situations. So what we're going to look at in this session is the materia medica for some of the most commonly used medicines in kind of acute emotional situations and stuff you're going to see in the clinic all the time. Of course, it's still based on homeopathic individualization. We're still looking for characterizing symptoms. Often we're looking for those concomitant symptoms, which may be physical symptoms, people who develop physical symptoms as the response of a trauma to help us choose a specific medicine. So in my clinic, I will use these very, very often. I also use flower essences very often. Again, this is just Greg's personal opinion here, but I would tend to use a flower essence more commonly when there's less specific characterizing symptoms. So if there's a really highly specific, peculiar symptoms, there's physical stuff going along with it. As primarily a homeopath, I find it easier and better for me, at least in that situation, to prescribe homeopathics. But I might use flower essences when someone has got less specific characterizing symptoms, where I go, okay, homeopathically that's quite hard to prescribe for because I haven't got enough information to choose between medicines, and so then those kind of situations I would often use a flower essence, and that may be someone's got a lot of change happening in their life at the moment. They're a little bit stressed by it, but there's nothing particularly that indicates really pathology. It's just they're dealing with the fact there's a lot of change going on. There's no particular disturbances, there's no particular symptoms as a result. So I wouldn't prescribe a homeopathic for that because there's no particular indications, but I might give them walnut as a bark flower essence, which is good for helping people cope with change, for example. So this session we want to focus on the homeopathics and the specific characterizing symptoms, and I think once you spot them, you might find that you recognize them in a clinical setting more often than you would have before we talked about the materia medica, at least. And the first one we're going to talk about is Ignatia amara, really frequently used medicine, both as chronic medicine, acute medicine, first aid medicine, Ignatia is a medicine you're going to use all the time, really. It's known as Strychnos ignatii, or the Saint Ignatius bean. This is a member of the Loganaceae, so it's the same family as Nux vomica, also gentialis as with Nux vomica, and these two medicines are really similar to each other. They're both really high in strychnine, and you'll see in the physical symptoms, and to a lesser extent, but also a little bit to some of the mental stuff, you can definitely see the influence of strychnine and the kind of toxic effects that strychnine has on a system in the symptoms of this medicine, and also Nux vomica. So when we make this medicine for its use in homeopathy, we make a tincture, or sometimes a trituration, from the seeds, which is where there's quite a high concentration of the strychnine. Herbally, this is not commonly used in contemporary herbalism, again because it's quite toxic, like Nux vomica. It has been used historically for a range of different situations, so digestive conditions, vomiting, anti-fever and malaria, diabetes, as a general tonic for irritability, and a bunch of other kind of indications. But contemporary herbalists don't tend to use it because it is quite a toxic plant. Pharmacology will be very reminiscent of what we see in Nux vomica. It contains up to 3% strychnine, and up to 2/3 of the total alkaloids in Ignatia are strychnine, so there's a strong strychnine effect, which we know we're going to see spasms and contraction and cramping and those kind of effects that strychnine has on the nervous system and the muscular system. Strychnine inhibits the glycine receptor, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and so increases the excitability of all parts of the central nervous system. So we see those spasms, convulsions, also salivation. Spasms is definitely a strong keyword for this medicine, just as it was as for Nux vomica. Gibson quotes that despite the similarity of alkaloid content, the two remedies Nux vomica and Ignatia are quite distinct from the point of view of total symptom picture and constitutional type. Definitely the mental emotional stuff is quite separate and different in a lot of ways. This demonstrates the importance therapeutically of employing potencies of whole natural products rather than using isolated alkaloids. And these guys actually kind of are a really good example. Some of the folks, Hahnemann for example, we know Hahnemann didn't really like the idea of us comparing medicines clinically based on the source material. So he was not a fan of us going, oh, well, these both belong to the same botanical family, so they must have similarities. And Ignatia and Nux is actually one of the examples he gives of that, because the mental emotional stuff is significantly different from each other when you look at the specific part. Though if you look at a bit more kind of macro level, you can see more similarities, but you can definitely see the similarity in terms of the cramping and the spasms, but the sphere of action is very, very similar, but the specifics are different between them. So it's kind of an interesting example of looking at that stuff. If we look at the trials, this was a medicine that was introduced by Hahnemann. Initially he was experimenting on one of his kids, his son, and also a female prover. Jorg did a trial on 11 male provers in 1822. Pide on himself and his daughter in tincture and low decimal potencies in 1853, and Wenner self-experimented with low decimal potencies around 1853. And so these are kind of the origin of these symptoms in the Materia Medica. It's actually quite interesting if you look across these, because again it's another example of a medicine that in our literature is dominantly talked about as for use in female clients, but most of the information actually comes from male provers, and I think it's kind of useful to keep that in mind. Theme. This is a nice quote from Latukas talking specifically about the way that you'd use this medicine in acute emotional trauma situations. He says, it's often indicated in sudden, severe grief states that render the individual speechless. A grief such as a death in the family. The Ignatia patient comes to believe that she's neglected her duty to the deceased person, and no one can talk her out of her irrational belief. She cannot talk about the grief, nor is she able to cry. Ignatia is considered practically a routine prescription for grieving family members. However, it is only truly indicated when the principal indications such as silent suffering, sighing, crying when alone, etc. are present. So Ignatia is like probably the most commonly used acute grief medicine, and significant kind of grief medicine. It's a medicine that I may often use in clinic. People are going to, say, a funeral for a very close loved one. I might get them to take a water bottle with them, with some Ignatia in it, so they can sip it, across that ceremony, and give them some support to get through that process. People who are really struggling with an acute grief trauma, and Ignatia is probably the first medicine we would think of. Not the only medicine, heaps others. As Viltuka says, we still want to look for the particular characterizing symptoms for this medicine. But if you remembered one thing about Ignatia, it's commonly used as an acute grief medicine. If we look at our Materia Medica a little bit to get some more specifics about what grief looks like in Ignatia and how you separate an Ignatia kind of grief from other medicines we also use for grief. It's described as being emotionally sensitive, refined, artistic. This is more in kind of constitutional prescribing. Romantic, idealistic, again, more kind of constitutional. Conflict between their romantic feelings and reality. So the constitutional picture in this is it's a medicine which, in especially the historical books, is often described as kind of teenage women or adolescent kind of women, with romantic ideals and fantasizing about their knight on a white horse who's going to come and rescue them and marry them, and they're going to live happily ever after. And then they get fairly sad and disappointed when it turns out that this knight on a white horse is trying to think of the appropriate word to use here, less than a knight on a white horse, shall we say, and then they get very disappointed and grief and upset by that, because they've been disappointed and let down by this knight being a bit of more of a shoddy character than they had pictured in the fantasy. So that's a bit of the kind of classic description of the psychological version of Ignatia. Dissatisfied with emotional life. Acute stuff, ailments from grief or disappointment. This can be disappointment in a romantic relationship. Another kind of grief is when a romantic relationship goes sour. So people who are going through a separation are really upset by it. You've got that client who comes in to see you who was dumped by a lover a couple of days ago, and they're not coping with it, and they're feeling hysterical about it, and they feel like they want to cry all the time, but they're trying to keep themselves together. You might think of Ignatia in those situations. A big thing that characterizes Ignatia, the next line, unable to cry. They might cry when they're alone and be sobbing, it's often described as a hysterical kind of medicine, a hysterical kind of crying, but they'll try to control their crying when they're with you, the practitioner, or when they're out in public. So it's like this really big, strong emotional grief. I mean, they're feeling their emotions a lot, but they're really trying to keep a calm surface and keep that under control, bottle it up and keep it inside them. That's kind of a thing which would make us think of Ignatia. They can be very brooding, silent grief. So again, keeping it inside, keeping it locked internally. Sighing is a big physical thing with them, and this is, I can comment it for lots of different types of Ignatia situations, but people who do that big sigh, yeah, that's an indication for Ignatia. So myself, every time I see someone go, I always think, Ignatia. I wonder if they're in an Ignatia kind of state at the moment. They close themselves off, they can become mistrustful or rude even, which is again about trying to keep that emotional stuff inside and a bit of separation between them and other people. Changeable moods, unpredictable, hystericals, again, really strong emotional experience, even if they're not necessarily always expressing that. Historically, it's also been associated with women's liberation. Again, we're getting more into the constitutional kind of area there, but definitely the idea of gender balance has been associated with Ignatia, especially in the 80s. If you read kind of Viltucus's writing in the 80s, he talks quite a lot about that because it was kind of culturally appropriate at that point of time, and probably still is in a lot of ways too. Gets overstrained, frustrated, conflict between her romantic nature, her work, becomes tense, sharp. Interesting symptom also, this fear of birds is a strong keynote in this medicine. Claustrophobia, insanity, anxiety about health, the kind of anxiety side of stuff is there. It's also medicine associated with anorexia nervosa, so as in there's specific psychological anorexia nervosa where people are avoiding food because of an eating disorder. Also, it's been associated with bulimia. A lot of folks will tell you, Princess Diana is a cultural kind of icon in our culture. And she's one that a lot of homeopathic mature medical authors will use Princess Diana and her kind of life story as an example of Ignatia, where she marries a prince who turns out to be a bit less than princely, so she becomes very disappointed by that, but leads this beautiful exemplary life and a very positive expression to the outside world, but inside we think there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of issues going on. She develops eating disorders and depression and all this kind of tragedy stuff that goes along with her life as well. So you'll see there's a lot of homeopaths would talk about Ignatia and Princess Diana as a great example of that kind of constitution, that kind of archetype. So that's the kind of stuff we're looking for in terms of the mental symptoms with Ignatia. It's grief, strong grief, especially if they're experiencing in an acute type way. So it may be from a grief that happened 2 days ago. It could also be from a grief that happened like 10 years ago or 30 years ago. But they're still experiencing it as if it's an acute kind of grief. It's still that kind of constant feeling that they've got that constant awareness they need to maintain to keep themselves under control, so they're not emotionally expressing in a way that they don't want to do it. That's the kind of thing very characteristic of Ignatia, the acuteness of the experience of the grief. Generalities will also be useful for you to spot this medicine. There's a lot of paradoxical, contradictory symptoms, things that move or change or are opposite to each other. They go back and forth between conflicting types of symptoms or opposites and move around a lot. Sometimes people might think of something like pulsatilla as being similar, but pulsatilla is more about the changeability, where Ignatia is more about the opposites and a contradictoriness of that. So they might have nausea, but it's better if they eat heavy food, things which are unusual for people there. Ailments from grief, emotional shock is the big one. Any physical ailment that started after a grief or an emotional shock, Ignatia would be one of the medicines that you would think of. Hysterical tendencies, symptoms. This is the physical stuff where you start to see the strychnine come through here. Numbness, cramps, spasms, tics, chorea. Clients who have that hysterical spasm. I had a lovely Ignatia case a long time ago when I was a student. I was giving a bunch of other medicines until I worked out it's actually just a really simple Ignatia case where a lady who had broken up with a partner and ever since then had this kind of hysterical spasm on one side of her face that would pop out at random times across the day, and so she was constantly trying to keep that under control and look professional, and when she wasn't able to, she'd get that face spasm come, which it would come most days, and a couple of doses of Ignatius just completely cleared that. Sudden momentary paralysis, so again, like a paralysis or a cramping or a sub-function, you get those neurological strychnine symptoms coming through. Emulation from travelling is recorded. Hirsutism, so kind of hairiness again, it's a constitutional symptom. Intolerance or aversion of tobacco is an interesting one. Ignatia is one of the medicines listed under the rubric in the repertory to a medicine to create disgust for tobacco. So it's sometimes used when people are trying to quit smoking. The idea being a lot of those medicines people have got an association with. If people use them, they kind of, that cigarette goes back to tasting like the first ever cigarette they had, which is usually not pleasant, and so it kind of like clears the acclimatization to that cigarette and the addiction which is built up over a period of time. So people go, oh, actually this is not so much fun, maybe I should stop smoking. There's a strong relationship with tobacco. In terms of the physical symptoms, there's a couple of particular things I want to point out that you should watch for the acute grief use of this medicine. One of them is in the throat area, the sensation of a lump in the throat, as if they have to cry. Everyone's got that feeling where someone's upset and they feel like they're about to start crying, and that swelling lump sensation in their throat which can occur. That's an Ignatia keynote. So someone says, I've got this chronic lump in my throat. The old-fashioned books would talk about quinsy, which is like a kind of chronic tonsillitis, and tonsils are chronically swollen. In Chinese medicine, they call it a plum stone throat. Like you've got that sensation of this is the stone from a plum constantly caught in your throat. That's really Ignatia keynote. In the kind of energy medicine spectrum, we'll say, well, that indicates there's a blockage of their throat chakra, which means there's something they're not saying, something they're not expressing, which fits in very nicely with Ignatia. That's all about holding that grief in and not letting people outside see how much grief you're experiencing. So a lot of throat lump stuff is very common, and might help you remember grief medicine, crying, lump in the throat. The other area where you very commonly see this medicine for grief is for upper respiratory, even lower respiratory in general kind of stuff. They've got hyperventilation, sighing again, respiratory complaints that are accompanied by sighing. Coughing is very strong in this medicine. A paroxysmal cough, so a spasmodic, intermittent, regular pattern kind of cough. Again, strychnine, cramping, spasms, kind of stuff you see in the cough. Cough which is aggravated by coughing, so they cough and makes them cough more, They can cough to the point where they have no time for inspiration, so they're coughing so hard they don't get a chance to take a breath in. Coughing increases the inclination to cough. Reflex cough, so something tickles in the back of the throat and it makes them cough, and it's very strong, and particularly in rubrics for things like cough from grief. So someone's had an emotional trauma, especially grief, and they develop a cough, acute or a chronic cough after that. That's pretty indicative for Ignatia, and that's not necessarily highly unusual. We know, Chinese medicine people will tell us that grief is the emotion of the lungs. It's common after someone has a grief situation to have respiratory issues go along with that, but homeopathically we can go, well, very commonly, frequently Ignatia's going to help with that. With the chest, there can be oppression, constriction, palpitation from grief, so that kind of, again, strychnine kind of cramping, spasms in the muscles that are involved in respiration will commonly come up with this medicine. So key things with Ignatia, I think, grief, hysterical kind of emotions, but unexpressing them, holding them in, lump in the throat. They might be getting coughs, they might be getting physical spasms, cramps, tics, tremors, paralysis kind of stuff that goes along with that. But the big thing is we use this for particularly strong acute experiences of grief, especially where people are trying to kind of hold back and not express and kind of maintain that a facade or that superficial presentation of things being okay, but inside there's a really strong experience of grief that they having a lot of emotions that are hard for them to cope with. Those kind of situations we could think of using Ignatia, and I would tend to use a higher potency a bit more often. I would use something like 200 Cs, for example, in a bottle of water and have them sip that, and at a funeral they could sip that every 15 minutes if they need to. Across that, they might have it several times a day for a number of days. It's really useful to help people in those situations.